The saying goes, there's lies, dang lies and statistics, but Agenda this week is speaking to three people who beg to differ. Treasury Minister Allinson and Jonny, Head of Economic Advisory, tell us about the new Isle of Man government dashboard and why it's important. Also, Kelvin Corlett, Head of Statistics Isle of Man, explains how statistics are gathered and why his organisation is staunchly independent of political interference. I began by asking Minister Allinson about the new dashboard.
The economic dashboard came out of a lot of the work that was done during COVID about bringing as much information together as possible, up-to-date information, so that it would help make decent policy decisions. Now, the quarterly report is still published. There's been a bit of a gap while we've established Statistics Isle of Man as being far more independent and robust in terms of the data they collect. So that will be in the public domain. But what we've done is publish the economic dashboard on the Treasury website so that people in the community or businesses can look at exactly the same data that government use to try to analyse where we're at with our economy, but also to try to look at evidence-based policies going forward. So it's part of the openness of government, but also we're hoping that by making this public, people can actually fact check some of the assumptions that are made about the economy. They can see what we're seeing. If they disagree with it, they can contact us as well. And we're quite happy to explain why we've collected that data. Occasionally, we will perhaps get statistics wrong, and then that feedback will help us have far more accurate and robust figures.
And of course, the figures stopped for a little while during COVID. I mean, we had been getting reasonably accurate, up-to-date figures prior to COVID, and then they stopped. There's sort of a sound reason there, because the figures were, first of all, they would be quite alarming because of COVID, and secondly, perhaps not that reliable or helpful because we were going through a bit of an emergency. Are we pretty confident? Are you pretty confident that the economic dashboard is likely to continue unless there's some really extreme event like that in the future?
Absolutely. This is a start, and what we're hoping on doing is growing the amount of data that's there. A lot of this data is publicly available, but this is a way of bringing it all together in one place. So we've got data from government itself, from the banks, from the FSA, from Douglas Borough Corporation, for instance, in terms of the footfall on Strand Street, so that when politicians say, I went out Wednesday night, oh God, the whole town was dead, they can actually look at that and say, well, actually, Wednesday night, it was always a bit quiet, but what we've seen is a return to, in a lot of the parameters, to the situation it was in 2019 before the pandemic. But you're right, during the pandemic, if you look at the number of people who were flying in and out of the island, in 2020 it flatlined because nobody was going anywhere. What we're now seeing is that recovery, and that's reassuring in some ways, but where we see that there hasn't been a full recovery, perhaps there's a reason for that we need to look into and adjust the policies to correct.
Your Council of Ministers colleague, Chris Thomas, often quotes his quote is evidence-based decision-making rather than decision-based evidence-making. Presumably this is the former rather than the latter.
Yes, it is. And I think nowadays, because of the immediacy of social media, politicians aren't the only ones who sometimes will go on perceptions. They'll see something and generalise it and think it's a real problem. It was interesting, I was on the Andy Winch's Man in Line show recently, and somebody phoned up to say that her son's friends were dropping out of university, and this could be a problem. And I promised to look into it. And the headline on the Manx Radio website at that point was warning Manx students dropping out due to high energy bills. And so I actually asked the Department for Education, and this year they had 26 students dropping out. The year before it was 45, and the year before that it was 73. So that perception that it was a real problem actually doesn't bear out when you look at the data behind it. And I think that's what we need to do. And that isn't government trying to spin. It's if there is a real problem there, let's grab it by the scruff of the neck and tackle it. But if there isn't, let's actually prove that so that we can provide the right policies, the right support for people, whether they be at university or in the community.
And your job, Jonny Platten, Head of Economic Advisory Team of the Treasury, is to ensure that the evidence that the Minister is using in these decisions is correct.
Yes, that's right. So a lot of this role and a lot of this dashboard comes down to collecting that information, making sure that it's correct and making sure that it's presented in a way that's useful for policy making. So as the Minister said, while a lot of this information does already exist elsewhere, it's really important to bring it together and be able to put the various pieces of jigsaw together. So when we're looking at the economy and asking ourselves questions such as, how is the cost of living crisis affecting the economy? What's really happening out there? We can look at a range of parameters, not just in one area, but across things like jobs, across things like footfall, the traffic on the sea and air routes, for example, and therefore take a kind of balanced view, looking across everything.
And in terms of that, then, how do you decide which bits of the economy are worthy of reporting on the dashboard and which bits aren't? Because inevitably, well, I'll use an example. You won't have, for example, on the dashboard how much milk is produced or how many beef cattle there are on the island, because that's a fairly specialised thing, I presume, and what you're looking at in terms of the statistics you present are more general across the whole island.
Yes, that's a very good point. I think that when we're looking at data sources for this dashboard and for how we present information to decision makers, you might be aware that the Allinson Numbers publication covers a range of things similar to what you just mentioned about things like the number of cattle and so forth. It collects information from DEFRA's agricultural census and so forth. But when we're looking at what could be presented on a kind of weekly basis, like this one is to policymakers, we need to consider what information is available at that kind of frequency. We don't want to necessarily put in a lot of information that maybe only gets changed once or twice a year or even once every couple of years, and then that's therefore quite out of date. So what we're looking at with this particular monitoring dashboard is the picture as up to date as we can get it. So when we're looking at footfall, we're looking at what's happened in the past couple of weeks. When we're looking at inflation, we're looking at the latest month's inflation figures, rather than these other things, which are still valid and important to look at, but perhaps on a lower frequency than we're talking about with this dashboard.
So is it updated weekly or monthly then?
So it depends on the data source, really. So some things like job seekers, for example, we get that information weekly. And I think during the COVID pandemic, we were even updating it every few days because we were looking at it with such a laser focus. But other things like inflation is kind of monthly. And there's a few other ones that come in quarterly, but we try and focus on making sure that everything that is on there is updated, is at least within the last month or so, and if possible, updated more frequently.
And of course, the benefit of this is that you can then see in reasonably real time when there are significant problems starting to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of why it's important to make sure we keep the focus on the bits of data that can be updated. So I mentioned the job seekers data, making sure when the pandemic happened, that's a kind of clear example, and you can see on the dashboard those couple of weeks when the lockdown started, for example, you can see the job seekers going through the roof, and that kind of thing was really important to monitor at that time to make sure that we had a handle on it. We knew that the feedback we were being given, that there were lots of people out of work, for example, from COVID. We could see that coming through, and likewise, as the economy restarted, we saw that number fall really quickly, and that kind of gave validation to the fact that we were seeing those reductions, and it wasn't just anecdotes.
And in terms of your role as economic advisor, what does that actually entail? I mean, is it just the minister that you advise, or do you provide advice for the whole of Council of Ministers, the whole of government, indeed possibly even Tynwald?
So obviously the bulk of my work is for Treasury, but it's also worth highlighting in the Economic Strategy Board, which is a subcommittee of the Council of Ministers. As the name implies, the Economic Strategy Board has been leading on the development of the economic strategy, and so a lot of work has gone into preparing the economic strategy. The information and the reports that KPMG have produced in development of that strategy, turning that information into a coherent economic strategy to sit over the top. That's been a big part of the role of the economic advisory function. And going forward, obviously, as the economic strategy has now been approved by Tynwald, a lot of the work will be around monitoring, in particular, the progress of the strategy and the delivery of the strategy. We're going to have initiatives being introduced for people as departments start to deliver on the strategy. So that will require a lot of oversight and analysis to make sure that those initiatives are delivering as they should do.
I'm guessing I know the answer to the next question. The phrase goes lies, damn lies and statistics. Presumably you don't adhere to that view.
No, definitely not. I think that it's really important when we're dealing with statistics to make sure that they're as robust as possible, as the Minister said, making sure that there is good governance in place around statistics, and I think that's why it's really important to have that. The Statistics Allemande focusing so much on developing robust statistics, so that when we're using those statistics in policy making, we can be absolutely sure that they're the right ones.
And then, Minister, I mean, is there a risk that with having this information in the way that it's presented in a reasonably up-to-date sort of way, because I do recall when I was in Council of Ministers, the quarterly report was very much, well, it was outdated by the time we were getting to use it, really. Is there a risk, perhaps, that ministers might be waiting and thinking, well, actually, we'll not make a decision on this. We'll wait for slightly better figures to come, and then we'll make a decision at that point?
Not really. What we're trying to do here is, as Jonny said, look at any trends that might be occurring that give us concern about the state of the economy, but also going forward with the economic strategy as it succeeds, and I'm absolutely convinced it will, we can chart the success. So, for instance, we've said that we're going to try to create 5,000 new jobs. Now, the actual part of the data is the private sector jobs. So at the moment we're at 36,800, which is the highest it's been since around about 2014. People can see in real time how that's developing. But they can also, by either members of the public or members of Tynwald, can then question us on our performance. And so it's getting that openness out there, I think, that's really, really important.
And of course, I suppose the other side of the question I asked is the public will be able to wait and pick and choose the statistics which best suit their cause. So, for example, I know benefits uprating takes place in September, based on September's inflation levels. But people might say, well, actually, the inflation in August was 2 or 3% higher, and maybe November was a better figure, and maybe we should go with that. Is there a risk of that?
I think there's always a risk with that, and that's why government have to be quite clear about their policy objectives. So we rate an awful lot of things with CPI in September, as you've said. It would be politically expedient to perhaps pick a lighter month, but we've actually said, no, it will be September rather than others. And I think we need to stick with that to give that trust in the way we calculate things like benefit upgrades, things like a whole range of other things that we try to key and tie to the economic development of the island. We saw during COVID that people became very, very interested in the COVID figures, and it was the headline every single day. We also know that when the jobless figures are announced or the inflation figures, they get headlines. But what we're looking at from a government in terms of sustainable finance for the Isle of Man is those long-term trends. So it will go up and down, but let's have a look at the long-term viewpoint, because that's where effective policy decisions come from.
And you mentioned there the economic strategy, which was approved at November Tynwald. Potentially the dashboard then could be maybe tweaked a little to better reflect or reflect the actual ambition of the economic strategy. So if someone is interested perhaps in the climate change element of the strategy, they can go and look at a specific part of the dashboard and say, okay, there's the climate change figures, we know where we are.
Yes, I mean, for instance, with climate change, perhaps you might be wanting to look at air pollution at certain areas on the Isle of Man, and that might be brought in. Things like annual CO2 emissions obviously have to be calculated very carefully, but with the economic strategy looking at the number of jobs that are available, the number of people in work, the number of perhaps new companies that are here, looking at long-term GDP, obviously normally calculated quarterly or annually, but looking at other things like population. Can we, in between censuses, get a better estimation of the number of people on the Isle of Man, perhaps the number of pupils in various schools? All this data is there. If we can make that available real time, government will have a much better idea of our successes and perhaps failures in terms of the economic strategy, and then pinpoint areas that we need to pay a bit more attention to.
And Jonny, I suppose from your perspective, it's all well and good having all these wonderful statistics, and we can have a statistic for this. We could have the dashboard used to demonstrate the success or otherwise of the economic strategy, but of course it takes time and resource to actually pull all this together. Are you confident that your team is sufficiently resourced to be able to deliver all the statistics that are required for this?
So I think, as the Minister said, there's obviously a lot more statistics that potentially could come down the line in the economic strategy, and that's something that now we're moving into delivery phase, how that's resourced and how the economic strategy is managed from the centre and so on. That's something we'll be looking at. Obviously, at the moment, with limited resource, that's why we talk about the consideration about different data sources and why some are prioritised over others for the kind of real-time dashboard. The data is all still there, but when we're talking about what we're looking at on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month basis, that's why we prioritise certain data sources over others to not generate too much work for not a lot of gain. But obviously, it's going to be a big project with the economic strategy, looking into the monitoring and the delivery of that, and that's something we're going to be looking at definitely.
And of course, Minister, finally, you have the unenviable task of trying to balance the books. And on the one hand, you know that having really good statistical information is going to be of great use for you as a policymaker, but you also know that there's probably not quite enough resource to be able to fund it as well as it could possibly be funded.
That's absolutely right, but it's getting that balance and it's trying to look at those key priorities. For instance, the dashboard has the up-to-date figures in terms of our reserves, how much money we've got in the bank, the rainy day fund, the NI fund, which is absolutely there to provide pension security for those people on our island. So it's important that people know the challenges we face, but also have the reassurance that their money is being well looked after, and also the ability to chart the success of government policies. And if they don't like what they're looking at, get in contact with their MHK and question them.
That was Treasury Minister Alex Allinson and Head of Economic Advisory Jonny Platten. Statistics Isle of Man is a relatively new body, as its head, Kelvin Corlett, explains.
So Statistics Isle of Man, we've been working under that name since around October of last year. Prior to us, there was the Economic Affairs Division, and that started out very much as an office within government producing data for government that then gets published. As time went on, Economic Affairs started to take on a few more rather than just purely economic data, some social data as well. And it was soon realised that we were looking at a situation where it was developing more into something like the Office of National Statistics or Statistics Jersey in this idea of a national statistical office. So the move to Statistics Isle of Man was made in order to reinforce that point and to start moving the ball forwards for the Isle of Man to have that, rather than just a government office of, say, information, as you might call it, but an actual proper statistics office. And we're very much in the early days of that, but that is where the journey is envisaged as going. The independence of a statistical office from political interference is a basic international standard at this point in time. The UK started moving towards that in around about the 90s, and Statistics Jersey is completely formally independent, with its independence guaranteed by law. So very much the desire is certainly to have a statistical office that the public can trust and that adheres to international standards as close as possible. I desperately wish it was that easy. Certainly technology has made a huge difference. Rather than making it easy in all aspects, I'd say that the power of technology is that it's allowed us to do more and in different ways. And certainly there are some ways in which it's made it a lot easier. So working with large data sets, a lot easier with a specialist piece of software than sitting there with paper or even a spreadsheet. However, we do still use more traditional methods where they're most appropriate. A good example would be the census of last year. Now, there was very much a push to have that as digital as possible, and we certainly did that via the digital by default method. But there has to be a recognition there that relying solely on that would exclude people. So we were offering alternative methods such as paper forms and allowing people to do it over the phone with someone. So those methods still very much have a place in our work. Generally, our work involves very targeted data collection. Whether it's inflation, we're going out and getting the data actively. Whether it's a survey, we're already specifying the kind of data we want. There are some areas where we might just have a mass of data and we have to go through that. But in those cases, you can implement a number of different procedures to try and get at what you want, what you is actually of value in there. There'll be certain telltale signs where you can look for bad data by comparing it with other data sets that are exactly as you want them to be. So you can compare that and make judgments based on the data that you're seeing. That although we're Statistics Ireland, although we're the statistical office, we're dealing very much with official statistics, national statistics that are these major figures that affect the life of the island. However, we don't produce all statistics that are issued. Our work is very, very focused at these particular types of statistics, which gives us slightly more ability to sift through things. Fortunately, in 2021, we published a code of practice relating to statistics. This came out of the work of the first meeting of the Select Committee on Poverty, where they called for our formal independence. Now, this code of practice was agreed in 221. It's available on our website. And it has a clause in there that very specifically states that sole responsibility for decisions relating to methodology and content of reports rest with, in this case, the head of statistics. And I would quite honestly point any minister or any politician, or indeed any senior civil servant who made such a request to that and said, well, this is a condition of our code of practice, so I'm sorry, we cannot actually fulfill that request or that demand.
Yes, I'm a governor of a relatively small school on the island, and you could have a year where all the children are incredibly gifted, and as a result you have an exceptionally good result, and then another year you may have one or two children who are less gifted than the others. And that has quite a dramatic effect and impact on the statistics. Small sample sizes can produce all kinds of interesting results.
Absolutely. They're very volatile to changes and external factors and internal factors. I think you do see that in the island relatively frequently, where you might see a jump or a fall in a certain figure, and the temptation is to look at that and think, oh my word, that's something of immediate concern, especially if you can't explain it right away. But as you say, often you have to wait to see how the trend develops, and it can just be an anomalous event, and things settle down into the previous trend quite quickly.
That was Kelvin Corlett, Head of Statistics Isle of Man. Obviously, it costs money to collect this information, but making decisions based on sound, up-to-date, reliable and independent data must be a good thing. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn, Goramayu, thanks for listening.